Tonight, efforts by Texas Republicans to redraw the state's congressional maps got new pushback from.
On August 16, 2025, the United States erupted with a wave of demonstrations under the banner "Fight the Trump Takeover," unfolding simultaneously across 34 states, from political hubs like Austin, Texas, to small towns as distant as Manistee, Michigan. Signs, chants, and a growing resistance to election manipulation spread rapidly. Crowds gathered to honk their car horns, wave placards denouncing the takeover through midterm redistricting, and push back against directives widely seen as driven by President Trump. In Austin, nearly 5,000 people rallied outside the Texas state capitol, protesting a redistricting plan expected to hand Republicans around 5 additional seats in the U.S. House during the 2026 midterms. The city has become the cradle of the movement, where leaders like Beto O'Rourke angrily condemned what he described as a tactic harmful to American democracy.
It's unclear exactly when all Texas Democrats will return to the state, but as long as there are 100 lawmakers available for a vote, which is quorum in the Texas House, it is expected the bill will pass. Jarika?
All right, Manuel Bojorquez in Dallas, thank you.
The resistance stretched far beyond Texas. In Oakland, California, hundreds gathered around Lake Merritt to denounce Trump-style gerrymandering. An inflatable chicken resembling Trump, laying eggs that hatched into Republican politicians, created a scene that was both satirical and serious, a sharp warning about the looming dangers to U.S. democracy. Even in small towns like Manistee, Michigan, about 50 residents rallied at the intersection of U.S. 31 and 1st Street, holding signs denouncing tactics such as population manipulation, minority vote dilution, and institutional subversion. They later marched to Veterans Memorial Park, where speeches centered on civic duty and resistance. Across the nation, more than 200 protests erupted in a single day, stretching from the San Francisco Bay Area to Washington, D.C. NBC Bay Area reported that demonstrators carried signs, while some brought along balloons shaped like chickens with Trump-like hair to amplify the "Fight the Trump Takeover" message. The organizers of this movement demanded that voting rights be protected before midterm redistricting dismantles principles of fairness. According to independent experts, Texas's new map could yield 5 additional Republican seats, a massive advantage in the House. Texas Democrats responded by breaking quorum, leaving the state to block legislative votes, effectively moving the battle from the State House into the streets. The protests have become a symbolic image.
Texans stay and fight. In this case, you have a bunch of cowards who cut and run.
From major cities to tiny towns, Americans from across the political spectrum stood roadside, waving signs to demand their votes be counted fairly. Even in small gatherings, the unified voices underscored the vitality of a democracy determined to defend itself. The following afternoon, after marches had spread across the United States, a tense atmosphere still gripped both crowded city streets and the corridors of power in Washington. The momentum of the protests against Trump takeover began to spill into other spheres of American life.
Don't mess with Texas. Don't mess with our district.
Transforming what had started as spontaneous demonstrations into a more organized wave of resistance, led jointly by civil society groups and high-level political figures. In the Capitol, thousands of people continued to rally outside the Capitol and the White House, waving banners that called for the defense of democracy. Alongside them stood labor unions, student organizations, and long-established civil rights groups, turning the protests into a kind of public forum. Many speeches were broadcast live on television and online platforms, where movement leaders stressed, "This is not just about one party or one president, it is about the future of this entire nation." In battleground states, the protests grew even fiercer. In Pennsylvania, demonstrators stretched for miles, prompting local authorities to deploy additional police forces to maintain order. In Georgia, Black community organizations joined churches in hosting candlelit marches at night, sending a message of resilience and the belief that power belongs to the people. In Texas, heated clashes erupted when pro-Trump groups attempted to confront the demonstrators, forcing police to step in and prevent violence from escalating. The movement also attracted growing international media attention. Images of tens of thousands of people marching across more than 30 states were broadcast by global news networks, fueling perceptions that the U.S. was sliding into a democratic crisis unseen in decades.
Texas reps who left Texas broke quorum and defied both Donald Trump and the ruling GOP party in the state to stop the gerrymander in the state. That took guts. That was courage. And the question is, how do you make that contagious? It can't all be on the Texas reps. We've got to do our part. Saturday is the part where we make it contagious. Saturday is the part where we show up and show the Texas reps they're not alone. They're not alone in this fight against Trump. So if folks are on the sidelines looking at what Trump is doing in Texas, what he's doing in D.C., what he's done to L.A., what he's threatening to do to Missouri.
We have got to recognize the cards that have been dealt, and we have got to meet fire with fire.
European newspapers described it as a new political earthquake, while Asian media outlets warned that instability in the U.S. could trigger ripple effects across the world economy, at a time when trade and global security were already fragile. On social media, the hashtags Stop the Takeover and Us Defend Democracy trended rapidly, with millions of shares within hours. Videos showing students, teachers, and workers marching together spread widely, creating what many observers called a digital storm that energized demonstrators on the ground. Analysts suggested that this online surge was what turned the anti-takeover protests into an undeniable political and social phenomenon. Meanwhile, the federal government tried to reassure the public. White House spokespeople repeatedly emphasized that all policies were in full compliance with the law and the Constitution. Yet these reassurances did little to quell the criticism. Opposition lawmakers in Congress pushed for emergency hearings and urged the Justice Department to investigate allegations of abuse of power in the redistricting process. Taken together, these developments showed that America stood at a volatile crossroads. Either the protests would continue to build momentum, pressuring the administration to alter its course, or the tensions would escalate into more dangerous confrontations. Whichever path emerged, one fact had become clear. The Trump Takeover was no longer just a political slogan, but a true test of American democracy's resilience and capacity for self-correction. In the days that followed, the wave of resistance against the Trump Takeover did not merely sustain its momentum. It evolved into a broad, organized social movement fueled by diverse segments of society. Demonstrations from the East Coast to the West Coast grew more frequent, blending peaceful marches with tense moments when police erected barricades to maintain order. In New York, Times Square turned into a sea of people, with tens of thousands waving banners, singing, and chanting anti-takeover slogans. Many well-known artists and musicians joined the crowds, performing impromptu shows that transformed the square into a vibrant, symbolic outdoor stage. In California, major universities such as UCLA and Stanford hosted open forums where students and faculty discussed the future of American democracy, while calling for concrete action to safeguard voting rights. Parallel to the street movement, social media continued to serve as a powerful weapon. Live streams from protest sites attracted millions of viewers, creating the impression that the entire nation was part of one massive demonstration. New hashtags such as Truth Defend, The Vote, and Stand for Freedom trended widely, reflecting the movement's expansion in both scope and participants. Young people were not only sharing images but also raising funds for civil rights groups, turning outrage into tangible financial support to sustain long-term activism. The federal government began to feel the pressure as states reported on the growing scale of demonstrations. Lawmakers from both parties spoke out, Democrats demanding investigations into alleged abuses of power, while some moderate Republicans expressed concern that the escalating tensions could further tear at the nation's social fabric. The Department of Justice even set up a special office to handle complaints related to political redistricting, underscoring that the crisis had reached an institutional stage. On the international stage, reactions grew sharper. The United Nations issued a statement expressing deep concern over the state of U.S. democracy, framing it as a test for a nation long regarded as a global model of democratic governance. In European capitals, solidarity rallies with the American protest movement took place from Berlin to Paris. Meanwhile, analysts in Asia warned that political instability in Washington could disrupt global trade, especially as supply chains have yet to fully recover after the pandemic. What stood out was that the protests no longer centered solely on opposing one individual or administration, but had shifted toward a broader discussion about the nature and future of American democracy itself. Citizens spoke about voting rights, social equity, and the conviction that a ballot should carry equal weight no matter which state you live in or which class you belong to. These conversations, whether held on sidewalks or in auditoriums, reflected a collective awakening that the current crisis was not just another cycle of power struggles, but a fundamental test of whether America can remain true to its core democratic values. In the days that followed, protests against the Trump Takeover swelled to unprecedented levels, prompting many observers to call it one of the largest civil resistance movements in modern U.S. history. From state capitals to the smallest towns, millions of citizens took to the streets, transforming what began as political outrage into a broad, nationwide social movement. In Washington, the National Mall was packed to capacity. Hundreds of thousands gathered for a symbolic event where civil rights activists, former politicians, and community leaders spoke side by side. The chants were not aimed at any single administration, but at defending democracy itself, rejecting any attempt to turn it into a tool for personal power. International media broadcast the event live, drawing comparisons to the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Across the South and Midwest, the pressure mounted. In Texas and Florida, both seen as epicenters of redistricting battles, demonstrators set up protest camps that lasted for days, demanding that local governments repeal laws perceived as restricting voting rights. Some mayors openly sided with citizens, vowing to take the fight to federal courts if necessary. The domestic turmoil quickly spilled over abroad. In Europe, human rights organizations urged the EU to monitor the situation closely and speak up in defense of global democratic values. In Asia, analysts warned that U.S. political instability could undermine investor confidence, triggering ripple effects across global markets. Even close allies like Canada and Japan voiced public concern, calling on Washington to uphold the democratic principles that have long defined America's credibility on the world stage. Inside the country, the social reverberations became increasingly visible. Universities turned into hubs of debate where young people deliberated on how to safeguard their political future. Churches, synagogues, and temples organized collective prayers for peace and justice. Labor unions staged brief strikes to show solidarity with the movement. The sheer diversity of participants underscored that this was no longer the agenda of a single party. It had become a broad, collective voice representing a shared democratic aspiration. Yet the path ahead remained fraught with risk. The Trump administration showed no signs of compromise, insisting that the changes were necessary to protect electoral integrity. Tensions escalated, and the risk of violence grew as extremist groups sought to exploit the unrest. Experts warned that America stood at a historic crossroads: either find a resolution through dialogue and respect for the rule of law, or plunge into a dangerous cycle of division that could last for years. Despite the uncertainties, one fact was undeniable. The Fight the Trump Takeover movement had left a lasting imprint on American society. It stood as proof that, in the nation's darkest hours, the voice of the people could still echo loudly enough to shake the political establishment. This was not just a fleeting protest, but a defining chapter in the ongoing struggle to defend democracy in the United States.